Today on the Playbook Podcast, breaking this morning, American and Russian officials will meet today to discuss the Ukraine peace plan. We have the latest on that. Donald Trump heads off for Thanksgiving in Florida with no healthcare plan on the table. And the latest on the retribution efforts against various Democrats by Donald Trump's Justice Department. Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Adam Wren. It's Tuesday, November 25th.
Adam, it's great to have you back. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great.
We need to talk about the ongoing peace negotiations over Ukraine because there's a big development this morning. We've broken on the Politico website at 5 a.m. that Donald Trump has sent an envoy to Abu Dhabi to meet with senior Russian officials to discuss the latest on the Ukraine peace plan. Now, this is a big deal, of course, because anyone who's been listening to this podcast and following this closely through the past few days will know that this peace plan has sort of moved around a lot, Adam. We had the original 28-point plan that Steve Witkoff came up with in collaboration with the Russians, which has been heavily criticized for being too pro-Russian. It got revised at the weekend in Geneva, mission led by Rubio in negotiations with Ukraine. And we now have a new peace plan that Kyiv likes a lot better. And today, the US is going to present that to Russians and we're going to see how they react. And we're going to find out if we're any closer to actually getting a peace deal. One of the interesting things about it, Adam, check this out. The guy they're sending to deliver the message to the Russians is once again the Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, not Rubio, not Witkoff, someone who probably a week ago most Americans hadn't even really heard of, has suddenly become one of the key players in this negotiation. What do you make of that?
It's quite unorthodox, Jack. You don't really see the Army Secretary involved in talks like this, but it is a kind of check in favor of the influence that Vice President J.D. Vance has in the broader, Trump White House. This is someone who is an ally of Vance, is close to him, and I think it speaks to where he could figure into a larger, Vance administration, if there is one here in a couple of years. So it sounds like there's a lot of confidence in him. I'm also interested, too, in Witkoff's role in all of this, and as well as Kushner. We reported in Playbook a few months ago that at a talk in Aspen that Steve Witkoff gave at R.A. Emanuel's annual shindig, that Witkoff said that if they were successful in Gaza with their peace deal, there could be kind of ripple effects in Ukraine and Russia talks. And so far as we can tell, there does seem to be some evidence, some momentum that they picked up in that case.
Yeah, it seems like after that, the Gaza peace plan went pretty well, as these things go in the Middle East. Trump basically said to Witkoff and Jared Kushner's son-in-law, can you just kind of repeat that trick on Ukraine now, please? There's some great reporting in the Wall Street Journal that published last night that gives some more of the detail about how this latest peace plan came together and how those two guys really helmed that process to the exclusion of Secretary of State Marco Rubio until quite late in the process. And I would say that's reflected in just how Russia-friendly that original plan was. We know that the 28 points have been whittled down to fewer than 20. And perhaps more importantly, we know that Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the Ukraine president, said last night that peace now appears, in his words, quote, doable under this plan, and that, quote, many of the right elements have been taken into account. So Kyiv a lot happier now with where this is at than where they were a week ago. The flip side, obviously, is that Russia will probably be less happy with what's being presented today, and we just don't know where Putin's head is going to be at. I was looking at some reporting in Russian media via the BBC. There are already sort of ominous noises in Russian media that they're not happy with what's coming. I got one paper saying that the European Ukrainian gang will correct Trump's plan so it's unacceptable for Russia. That's the sort of thinking over there, and we might well find that Moscow isn't happy with how it's been revised. So, don't hold your breath yet as far as peace is concerned. Driscoll is such an interesting character. If you don't know who Dan Driscoll is, Dasha actually had him on the Conversation podcast only last week. So you should go back and listen to that because that's an in-depth conversation with the guy who was meeting the Russians this morning. He's a 38-year-old lawyer, Army veteran. As you say, Adam, went to Yale with J.D. Vance. They're very close friends, obviously both Army veterans. As you say, Army secretaries aren't generally involved in negotiations. Now here he is set off to meet with the Russians of all people. This is like top-end diplomacy. This is something that people study for decades to do.
Yeah, Donald Trump brings a business mindset to the White House, and we saw that with Jared Kushner in the first administration, and really this one, where he's willing to put people into places where they may not have domain expertise, but they have what Trump would say is real world expertise, whether it's in the real estate business or elsewhere. And he doesn't mind, trying out those unorthodox arrangements, and sometimes that seems to work objectively, and sometimes it doesn't. But Driscoll is one of these people who does seem to have some upward mobility in the Trump administration, and is performing in a way that seems to be pleasing people in Trump's orbit.
Yeah, and you would sort of assume he's of the same mind as Vance on this. And we know Vance is not exactly Mr. Ukraine, is he? He was posting messages about this yesterday. I don't know if you saw them, but he was basically saying, look, the US is in a mess. He didn't use these words, but the US is in a mess. Housing's too expensive. People are struggling. Why are you guys all so obsessed about Ukraine? You should be more bothered about your own country, which is definitely not the sort of pro-Ukrainian message some Republicans like to spout.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jack, to me, from a 2028 Republican presidential primary perspective, because you do have kind of a clash of instincts when it comes to foreign policy between Rubio and Vance. Rubio is kind of campaigned, previously as more of an internationalist, a hawkish figure, and Vance is certainly more of an isolationist. And so we've seen those instincts play out differently in the way that they've talked about this peace plan and this peace process, and the way that they've talked about Ukraine, and for that matter, Europe. We saw, Vance give his stinging address about Europe, taking them to task earlier this year, and that still is resounding overseas. Rubio has a very different tone on all of this, and so it's interesting to see which vision is going to win out the day here.
Absolutely. And we talked a lot on the podcast yesterday about how Rubio really seemed to take control of this process as best he could at the weekend after being not totally blindsided by this original plan, but certainly hadn't had enormous sight or input into it at that stage. He certainly has now. Wonder how he feels that it's Driscoll being sent off to meet with the Russians today. We'll have to see how that plays out.
To be fair to Secretary Rubio, he's wearing a lot of hats at the moment and has
Right.
a number of different jobs, and so he's got to keep the plate spinning.
Indeed, he does. That's true. The other thing, just on this, before we finish on this subject, is to flag is that all the other countries involved in this, the Western European nations, NATO allies of America, who are increasingly funding this war and backing Ukraine to the hilt, are having a leaders call this morning at 10 a.m. where they will discuss the latest developments. We don't think Donald Trump is going to join that call, but we don't actually know for sure. But either way, they're all getting their heads together to discuss the fact that I think they feel they've got this into a better place from their point of view than it was a few days ago. But it's all moving very fast. Trump would still like a deal this week if possible, although that deadline has now clearly been loosened. So I think we'll see lots more developments on this pretty quickly in the days ahead. Let's talk about domestic stuff. Trump himself is heading off to Mar-a-Lago today, Adam, for the Thanksgiving break. He's got the important matter of a turkey to pardon at the White House before he goes. The real turkey, though, if I can use the world's worst pun, is his Obamacare announcement, which was supposed to come this week, we believe, and got pulled yesterday at the last minute because so many Republicans were unhappy with what appears to be Donald Trump saying, yeah, I can't Obamacare, not so bad. Let's extend the subsidies for another couple of years while we change the rules a bit. Were you surprised to see so much outcry and backlash within the conservative world to what Donald Trump was apparently about to lay on the table?
I wasn't, because we saw a lot of this same talk from the congressional GOP during the shutdown. Extending the ACA was an anathema to them then, and it is now, of course. What's interesting here, Jack, is there was a conversation between former President Barack Obama and President Donald Trump when he was coming into office in 2017, when the transition was unfolding, and Barack Obama, asked him to think about the legacy of Obamacare, and told him to call it something different. and was really hopeful that Trump would keep that in some way, form, or fashion. And here we are. What is it? 8 years later, and President Donald Trump, finally made good on that promise. His first term, the big joke, along with Infrastructure Week, was unveiling the Republican healthcare plan. That never really happened. But here we have Trump, entertaining the idea of extending the ACA to a certain extent, and his own party rejected that idea. So it does seem like if you take this Affordable Care Act move that ultimately didn't work out, and the way that people like James Blair, the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, are talking about affordability. He had a tweet over the weekend where he echoed that Trump and Mamdani agreed about affordability as an issue. It does seem like the White House, ever so slightly, Jack, is trying to tack ahead of the midterms and adjust to what they saw from the electorate in the off-year elections earlier this month.
No, I'm sure that's right. They've taken the message on board loud and clear, and aware that the clock is ticking now to try and change those voting numbers that we saw in November ahead of next November. And I think that's going to have to be pretty relentless messaging from the president. And I'll be interested to see if we see a bit less of the no, it's actually all fine, you're all wrong sort of line for the president, and a bit more, yes, we need support. And actually, that's why the Mamdani thing was so interesting, because he did appear to be aligned with Mamdani on this. And of course, Mamdani is not saying, no, inflation's over, everything's fine. He's saying people are really struggling. And Donald Trump seemed happy to align himself with that message. Not everyone in the Republican world is happy about that, are they? Because they were sort of thinking their 2026 plan was going to be to demonize Mamdani and say all the Democrats are like him. And suddenly Trump cozying up with him in the White House. They hated it, didn't they?
Yeah, it's a massive problem for Republicans going into next year. And none other than Elise Stefanik, who is tying her Democratic opponent to Mamdani. This really presents a wrinkle for her. And of course, she's had a series of them. She was almost going to be UN ambassador. And so she continues to deal with an unpredictable and occasionally capricious, to her reading of the situation, Donald Trump. And he continues to throw her curveballs.
The other thing the White House is keen to do is make sure it's got its base back on side after the various wobbles we've seen this year, not least over the Epstein files, but other issues as well, as we've talked about a lot on this podcast. One of the ways it seems to me, Adam, they really want to do that is by pushing ahead with prosecutions or clampdowns or essentially attacks using legal means, if possibly, against their enemies. We've seen some pretty big developments on that front this week already, and it's only Tuesday morning. The first one, of course, James Comey's prosecution and Letitia James' prosecution, thrown out yesterday pretty dramatically by a judge who said that Lindsay Halligan, Trump's appointed prosecutor, was not properly appointed, and therefore any prosecution she undertook were invalid, thus ending those cases, which is kind of embarrassing for the president. But White House is pretty bullish on this, Adam. They say that they're going to come back and essentially have another go, and that this doesn't prejudice the case. And the legals are a bit murky of it, but that case was already going badly for them. It might actually be that this allows them to start again and try and put a better case together than they did the first time, which frankly would look like a bit of a mess.
Yeah, Jack, whenever MAGA faces divisions, the best way that Trump has found to reunite the coalition is to find a common enemy that can bring them back together in opposition to something other than himself or people in the MAGA movement. And we're seeing that again here. The question is just whether or not it'll stick. I just think it's so remarkable if we look back at the last 11 months here in his time in office, that really, the revenge tour has been the number one plot in a lot of ways. And we're starting to see denouement in some of these cases where it just doesn't seem like some of these are gonna stick. And the maximalist approach that Trump has taken throughout his time in office the second time around, may be hitting a brick wall on several fronts.
They've found a new bunch to go after, which was this gang of Democratic politicians, former service members, who put this video online last week in which they said to members of the armed forces, don't follow any illegal orders if they come up. That has been seized upon in MAGA world and by the White House, and we've seen them really going after these people. Trump suggesting it was seditious. The Department of Defense yesterday really going after Senator Mark Kelly, who of course is a former captain and suggesting he might be court-martialed for this. They've created a real sense of anger within their movement. If you turn on Fox News or conservative talk shows, they're talking about this all the time this week. And once again, creating a common enemy to get angry about in exactly the way you described.
I wonder, Jack, whether the Federal Election Commission is going to require Pete Hegseth to report that as an in-kind contribution to Mark Kelly's 2028 presidential campaign, because this does wonders. This does wonders for him, and it does wonders, too, for someone else we featured in the Playbook newsletter recently, which is Alyssa Slotkin, the senator from Michigan, who was at the forefront of this. Earlier this year, she released a battle plan for Democrats to sort of get out of the wilderness. And part of that is picking battles that they think that they can win. And so the fact that Democrats, particularly national security Democrats like Mark Kelly or Slotkin, are getting elevated on this particular issue, this is actually, I think, the rare instance where Trump has picked a poor political battle and is actually elevating foes on the Democratic side who are strong in this area and who are on firm footing.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, we've seen with Gavin Newsom already this year and others how if Trump comes after you and you fight back hard, the Democratic base absolutely loves it, right? I mean, Gavin Newsom's been elevated into pole position as things stand for the 2028. There's a long way to go. I was watching Mark Kelly on Rachel Maddow's show last night on MS Now, as it's now called. And you're dead right. He suddenly had the opportunity to sit there and say, hey, look, I've had missiles blowing up next to my airplanes. I've flown a rocket ship to space. This isn't stressful for me. Like, basically, here's how great I am, guys. And all those Democratic supporters listening to that and lapping it up.
Yeah, you wonder if Vice President J.D. Vance is sort of tuning in to some of these cable hits or catches a glimpse of them and thinks to himself, I favored a little bit more taking on Gavin Newsom than I do Mark Kelly, given his military record. And so I think that's interesting.
Here's something that's definitely on a lighter note, but pretty big news if you live in DC and you've got two small kids like I do. There is a pregnant elephant at the National Zoo in Washington, and this is pretty much all anyone's talked to me about in the office today. And rightly so, because we're going to see an elephant birth in Washington, and there's only ever been 2 elephant births in the history of the National Zoo, 136 years. This is going to be a third one. I sort of feel like, everybody needs a little bit of light in their lives in Washington at the moment. It's been a pretty long year for people covering politics. I feel like a baby elephant can liven things up a bit, right?
Yeah, I do think that, but everything is political. And of course, the elephant is the adopted animal of the Republican Party. And so I think there's a political metaphor here. I'm just not quite sure what a pregnant elephant signifies. I'm not going to venture any further than that.
I can't believe you've politicized the baby elephant, man.
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
There's a metaphor here, and someone more thoughtful than I is going to write a 5,000 word think piece about it, and I can't wait to read it.
All right, email me and Adam with your politicized elephant takes, and we'll stick them in the Playbook newsletter, which you can find, I should plug, at politico.com/playbook. As always, that's all we got time for. Thanks so much for being with us, Adam. Thanks all for listening. We shall be back tomorrow. Have a great day.